there is, when you look at human evolution, like a very particular sort of community arising in early humans. It's very important and distinctly about who we are. It's like altruistic. That arises long before civilization does. We see, for example, people with what would normally be fatal injuries because people can take care of themselves, living and like mending bones because people are taking care of them. We see people living outside of their natural family units at times. So you can see things that are kind of somewhat like adoption and such. You can see people burying the dead. You can see things that are arising in human community, long before civilization rises far more recently, right? That happens as like humans are spreading out across the earth. So they have these abilities, they have this community that is actually reflecting something about who God is. So if you're going to focus on like the attribute side of the image of God and acknowledge that that's the whole thing, maybe the image of God does really arise. I mean, really ancient.
I would say if you're going to think about that, I look at the attributes as equipment, as tools, as the toolbox given to humans to accomplish the imaging task. Again, defining the image as a status. None of what you just said, I see it in any way as contradictory to that. But I think you need to think a little bit more about the difference between a quality and a behavior. In other words, some of those things that you mentioned would be a behavioral thing that now I as a person am applying this point of knowledge that I learned because I'm gifted with this attribute to do this other thing. There's behavior, which is an application of the quality, and then there's the quality. Those are two related but different things. So I think you need to parse that out.
I agree that there are distinctions, but we can only observe certain things in the fossil record, right? So we can observe certain things arising pretty far in the past.
Here's a question. When does civilization start in the biblical record?
It really seems to be, the promulgation of cities, but it doesn't say Cain city is the first city. It just says that he went out and made a city. So in the biblical record, I think there's ambiguity about that. But I think what becomes important is that Cain's lineage ends up being very tightly associated with technological progress and the rise of civilization.
And we also need to throw in the fact that it was viewed very negatively.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, his lineage makes the first sword.
I only asked the question because I think in the biblical story, as it plays out, civilization is a post-fall thing. I think it still would have happened without a fall. In other words, as the population grows and as imagers relate to each other, and you're still doing tasks and whatnot, you must have civilization. I mean, civilization is just where do we live, food supply, the water supply, the division of labor. You do this task, I do that one. It would be an inevitable thing to have happen, but the fall sort of forces it on the set of circumstances, and it's divorced from Edenic circumstances.
Now we're diverging a ton, but I think what's interesting about it, if we think about Neanderthals, is that they never experienced civilization as we see it. They probably were involved in cave art.
There were no settled communities.
What you would see in the fossil records, at times there's agriculture, but it's never quite year-round agriculture sustained for thousands of years like you see now. It's possible that there might have been places that people came back to regularly. There's like certain mines for actually paint, like ochre mines, that will be mined for thousands of years. But there's still much more nomadic. There isn't the ability to have large amounts of food in fixed locations for long periods of time, and so there's no cities.
Again, I could approach this differently in light of what you said and say something like this. Well, given the capabilities that Adam and Eve are going to have, they're going to share with other humans outside the garden, then the fall becomes, something that changes the set of circumstances because of what God's elective will, was aiming at. So there's a change there. But the notion that you couldn't have civilization or you wouldn't without the fall, I'm rejecting that. I think you would have had it anyway. If I'm going to admit that, then yeah, you can have civilization before a fall, i.e. before Adam and Eve.
I think there's a really interesting puzzle to think about Neanderthals because they are human-like.
Would you say they're human-like or a different kind of human?
I think there's debate right now among scientists, and the pendulum goes back. So depending on when a person watches this video, the pendulum will either be on the point of view of like they're just like us, or the pendulum will be on the point of view that they're different than us. But really, either way, there's like a paradox there. They're not quite like us. But one of them would be is if they don't descend from Adam and Eve, they wouldn't be fallen in the same way that he is. And so, but they'd still be subject to death. And that's not necessarily a problem, but I think that's like a particular category that we don't have around today. And they would have never experienced civilization as we know it. Like maybe they would really hate living in a house and would just be intrinsically wanting to go out camping and hunting and living that way. And they would just think that a supermarket was an abomination to the earth. Who knows?
Right. Certainly the internet, social media.